Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Abram Kielsmeyer-Jones, and we are looking at Mark 13, 14 through 23. This is part 4 of this section of Mark 13, and I anticipate we will wrap it up. This seems to be a pretty distinct end of a section, end of a passage here at the end of verse 23. I'll talk about why when we get there. But today we will cover a little bit of review just so we're all caught up on where we are in the passage, verses 14 through 20. And then we'll look again briefly at verse 20, and then we'll do 21 through 23, and we'll plan to wrap up there today. You should be seeing my screen and hearing me okay. Please let me know if you're having any issues of that. And the way that you can communicate with me is through the questions box. There is in the GoToWebinar control panel, there's a number of sections. One of them is the questions box. Just make sure the arrow to the left of it is pointing down so that it's expanded, and you'll see a little rectangle where you can type in any comments or questions you have. Those just go to me, and I'll either respond privately or share anonymously your comment or question with the group and respond to it there. We are recording today, so if you are here live, you're going to get an email with a link to the recording once it processes. You'll also get a link to the handout in your email this afternoon. And if you're here live, in the GoToWebinar control panel, there is a handout section. The handout is also housed here at tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. So if you're watching this later on a recording and you want the handout, you can go to tinyurl.com/Mark Translation Notes. That's just a shortcut to a shared Google Drive where I have all of the Mark Translation Notes handouts. And you can email me here at abramkj@accordancebible.com. Just by way of reminder, what we're about in these webinars and these translation notes webinars is we're looking at the lexical and grammatical questions that arise when we translate the Greek text of Mark into English. So we're focusing more on the act of translation than we are any particular accordance features per se. We have many webinars and lots of help documentation available for that. And you can ask about that if you've got questions, but otherwise we're focused on the Greek text and the lexical questions that come up. So what does this word mean? How is it used in this context? How is it used elsewhere? And then also the grammatical questions that arise. Why are these words in this order? What do they do when they work together? Things like that. And then, of course, the big question is, how do I translate this in a way that is faithful to the Greek text and also readable in English? All right, let's dive into review from the last 3 weeks. This is Jesus' speech continued. He says, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then let those in Judea flee to the mountains. And the one on the roof must not go down or go inside to get anything out of his house. And the one in the field must not go back to get his coat," that generic pronoun there, so it's anyone. "But woe to the ones who are pregnant and nursing in those days. But pray in order that it might not happen in winter," or just pray that it might not happen in winter. "For those days will have suffering, the likes of which has not happened from the beginning of creation which God created until now, and which never again will happen." You can see I left my somewhat wooden with brackets and slashes translation from last time. In a final draft, this would need to be smoother than this. Verse 20, "And if the Lord had not shortened the days, nobody would have been saved," or nobody would be saved. "But because of the chosen ones, because of his chosen ones," implied, "whom he chose, he has shortened the days." So we can pick up on verse 20 today, and we looked at this last time. We didn't get terribly far, but just to look at it again, we have this interesting, almost playing with tense here, and even in English, how you phrase this is something you would want to think through. But the idea is that there is an intervention that is as good as done because God is going to do it. And so it's about the viewpoint from which this statement is made. And that's the viewpoint of having seen God shortening, the Lord shortening those days, thereby saving people. And so when you think about how do I do that with the tenses, and then both in Greek and English, that gets a little challenging. Let me just open up instant details here. So we've got an aorist verb here, if the Lord had not shortened. And the idea here is really, I think, more about viewpoint than about time or tense. And so the idea is that this is seen as a whole, essentially a completed act. It's as good as done, whenever it is. If the Lord had not shortened those days, nobody would be saved. Nobody would have been saved. But as I said, this is a little bit tricky because Jesus is talking about a future day. When you see something in the future, here's what you should or shall do. Pray that it might not happen in winter. It has not yet happened, and when it does, pray that it's not winter, and those days will have. So we're in the future. So verse 20, somehow in translation, and I suspect that you may be able to find a better way than I've done here, but somehow you want to stay with that future view, but again, it's looking at this event, this intervention, as if it's happened already, as a kind of snapshot. And if you wanted to get more into the weeds on this, this would be worth going to a Greek grammar, and probably I would recommend Decker on this. And go to aorist, go to the aorist verb, and see how he talks about aspect. This may take a little bit of searching through here, but you might even just go to all English and search aspect. And he's going to talk about that more. If you've got comments or questions, I gladly welcome them. But just since we're reviewing this verse, I just want to raise that point that, again, this is about the viewpoint of this is as good as done, but somehow that needs to be still indicating in your translation that Jesus is talking about a future time. And we talked briefly about this idea of the chosen ones or the elect. We'll see that word again today. We've got this word eklektos. And if you triple click, well, you can even just see in the instant details, the two translation equivalents are elect or chosen. Now, I think when we hear the word elect, we might think about that in specific narrow theological terms, which is not necessarily what Jesus is talking about. I mean, I think that's a point of interpretation. So personally, I favor chosen here, although even that raises a question, which chosen people are we talking about? And we alluded to that a little bit last time. There's some comment here from Strauss. And if you've got comments or if you've given this some thought or research over the last week, I'd love to hear about it. But the short answer to the question, who are the chosen ones? Well, Strauss puts it nicely. He says, one's interpretation here depends on one's understanding of the discourse as a whole. Although even if you're reading this all as happening in the first century, I don't see any reason why chosen has to be confined to Jewish people. You've already got this this movement toward Gentile inclusion at play in the first century. So the good news in translation is that there is no requirement to stipulate exactly who the chosen are. In fact, that would be over translating. In other words, if you were going to say, but because of the chosen ones, and by the chosen ones, we mean X, Y, and Z, that's a key part of interpretation, but it does not need to be included in translation. But if this is of interest to you, I've put this Strauss quote again here so that you can use that as a springboard. And yeah, I mean, I think if you were to want to study this further, your commentaries would have more comment. Also, the question of how does Mark use this word? Maybe we start there. I'm just going to add a range to this search to get to Mark quickly. And we see here that it's the first time, and in fact, it will come up again today, so we'll circle back and next time. So it's an important word for the passage, but it's not a word that Mark has used before. So we don't have this clear this idea of, oh yeah, this is a theme in Mark. He's been talking about this. I know who that is. Well, it's the first time Mark mentions it. So we need to do some interpretation there. But for translation, I've just got, but because of the chosen ones whom he chose, he has shortened those days. I'll say just one more thing about this verse, and if you've got comments or questions, I would love to hear them, and we'll pause for them in a minute. Notice that you've got this almost redundant sounding chosen ones whom he chose, or the elect ones whom he elected. You've got the chosen ones comes from eklektos, and then we've got the verbal form eklegomai. And so we're looking at really, and you can see this here in the instant details, we're looking at the same roots here. And so it's really just different forms of the word. So we've got a noun here, or I guess an adjective and a verb. So my only, out of all the uncertainty, I think, or different possible interpretations, the thing I'm pretty firm on as a translator is I want this word to be the same between both the adjective here and the verb. So in other words, I want to translate it as the chosen ones whom he chose, or the elect whom he elected. Now, I mention that because that is not necessarily the case in other translations. And those translation committees far exceed my expertise, but I also feel free to disagree with them, and I hope you do too. So I would not, for example, personally translate it like this: the elects, for the elect's sake whom he chose. Or even here, you've got this in the Berean Bible, but the CEB does the sake of the chosen ones, the ones whom God chose. So you might even just compare this, but I did notice as I was preparing today, quite a few translations that had elect and chose. And personally, I favor the consistency here. Try to show in English, if you can, that this is the same root in Greek. That's, to me, part of what it means to transmit the Greek as precisely as possible. All right, that's all by way of review, although I wanted to say a little bit more about how we translate chosen and chose. And of course, however you translate this word here, we'll need to carry that over into verse 22, because we've got tous eklektus again. So it's the same group of people, as far as we can tell. So keeping that consistent across verses, I think, is important. Let me know if you've got comments or questions, and then we'll do verses 21 through 23. All right, seeing none, let's read. Kaitate ean tis humin epe, ide hode ha Christas, ide eke me pistuete. Left to right, it's something like, and when, or and then, if someone to you should say, behold, here the Christ, or the Messiah. Behold, there, do not believe. Now that alone will not give us a final draft for a translation, but it's a good starting point. Here's how I've translated this verse. And then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. And I'll talk about why I've got these brackets here. Gundry, in his commentary on Mark, says Jesus now gives another warning against deception. We had this at the beginning of the passage. Deception that, if successful, would keep his disciples in Judea from fleeing to the mountains for safety. So there's a very practical reason here. I mean, it is enough to say, don't be deceived, because being deceived is not a good thing. But there's another implication here, which is that if you are deceived, if you don't think there's a problem, then you're not going to flee, which is everything that Jesus had just said in some specific instances in the prior verses. Go to the mountains, and then he gives these: if you're on the roof, don't go into your house first. If you're in the field, don't go back. If you're pregnant and nursing, woe to you. If it's in the winter, even worse. All of these things, a person could potentially ignore those warnings if they actually believed that this was the Christ or the Messiah. But Jesus is saying, don't believe it. And he'll go on to specify these are actually false messiahs and false prophets. So that's Gundry on this. We've got this aeon tis humin epe. If anyone should, subjunctive, say to you. So you've got epe here, aorist active, subjunctive, third person singular. I've said this before, I'll say it again, we tend not to use the subjunctive in English, even as much as we might have 40, 50, 60 years ago. So if you think about a more archaic, quote unquote, proper English, whatever that means, this would be something like, and then, even if anyone should say to you, or if anyone should say to you, and I wonder even, I suspect some of the, yeah, here's the ASV, if any man shall say unto you. So you've got that shall for the subjunctive. But we don't usually do that in English. The subjunctive is kind of, I mean, it still exists, but we don't use should say or shall say. It's more like the indicative replaces it. And so here, the Berean Study Bible is a great example of this, and CEB and others. At that time, if anyone says to you. Now, says is indicative, whereas should say or shall say is subjunctive. So are you translating the subjunctive with the indicative? Well, yes, kind of. The subjunctive sense is still there. It's just a question of what makes sense in English today. But I think you'll find most modern translations will have the indicative here, King James being an exception, and you can see how language has evolved, even just thinking about how you talk to folks. If you were to give a conditional instruction to somebody, the chances would probably be slim, at least speaking for myself, I would probably not use the subjunctive in English in that kind of, if this happens, if this should happen to you, then do this. I would just say, if this happens to you, then do this. And the if is doing the work of the subjunctive there in English. So that's why I've put it as if anyone says to you. And then we get this wonderful word, ide, for behold, and we get it twice. You could triple click on that, and you get a nice entry here in BDAG. Triple clicking just took me to my default lexicon. And it is to point out something to which the speaker wishes to draw attention. And it even has its place right here in number 3 in BDAG under ide to indicate a place or individual. So look at that person. Behold may sound archaic to you. I still think it's a great word. That's just a decision for you to make as a translator. Look is probably the more colloquial way to say it, and it really is saying the same thing. So that's the hypothetical here. Somebody is saying, look, look at what? Well, here the Christ or the Messiah, and then look there. Okay, so we get this what's called ellipsis. These are, first of all, you've got a verbless clause here. Behold, here the Christ. And you can see in the diagrams, if you've got them, the ones that are completed, you can do your own, of course, but in accordance, there are some completed diagrams, and they're really helpful about actually showing you the grammatical structure of the sentence. And here we've got, so if anyone should say to you, behold, that it's an interjection. It almost, you can see here how it almost stands outside of the formal sentence structure. But here we've got the Christ is here esteemed. That would be, if you were to just diagram this with your subject at left, your predicate or verb at right, that is implied, but it's a verbless clause. So the question then, what does this have to do with translation? Well, the question is, do you keep your Greek verbless clause verbless in English? Try it. See if it works. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. If you try to bring it over as a verbless clause in English, it would say something like, look, here, the Christ. I'm not so sure that works. So I have, look, here is the Christ. But you might even experiment. You could even just say, look, the Christ. Then you don't bring hode out. So I would play with that, but I think you're more likely to find a verbless clause in the Greek New Testament than you are in, like, if you and I were just having a conversation about the weather or something like that. So I think it would be more expected to bring out the implied verb there. And now the next phrase, ide eke, not only is that verbless, but it's subjectless grammatically. It's implied, but again, just decide what you want to do in translation. And you can see here in the diagrams, ha Christos, it's in parentheses because it's implied, and then estin, implied as before, but all you get here is a K. And again, the reason why you would be more, I guess, one-to-one on this is translation. There's a certain urgency in these Greek words, or the Greek phrasing of it, that you may really value in your translation. And so if you can find a way to bring it over and it's readable, great. So something like, behold, here the Christ, behold there. Again, I don't think that really makes sense, but the idea is this urgent, almost this breathless, and I put this in the handout, the text has this effect of here, there, look over here, look over there, almost like people are saying, look or behold all over the place. That's the sense that I get of the passage. And then our task as translators, once we understand the Greek, is to decide how do we best articulate that in English. So you could even split the difference and do a translation, something like, look, here is the Christ, or look there. Just leave it at that. So if anyone says that, then what? Well, do not believe it. Just do not believe in the Greek. And if you want to leave your translation as just do not believe, that's fine. You'll see some commentators, some translations say do not believe it, do not believe him, do not believe them, do not believe that person, do not believe the reports. The UBS Translator's Handbook has a great, very succinct comment here. It says, do not believe it may be rendered as do not believe him or do not believe what he says. The Greek text employs simply the verb pisteuo without object, but some languages require some direct object, whether personal or non-personal. Now, as a translator's handbook, this is speaking about much more than just our move in these webinars from Greek to English. It's talking about going from Greek into any language. And there will be languages that require a direct object. I would think English is along those lines. You don't have to have one here. Look, there he is, don't believe. That kind of makes sense, but it still leaves something implied. So just think about if you want to bring out an object there. And then the next question is, well, what is the object? What I did not comment on a whole lot in this verse is, what does ha Christos mean? It's the Christ or the Messiah, and you'll see in your English, even in a stripped down Pew Bible that is, or if you get like a $6 economy Bible, it doesn't have any study notes, even those ones will have a footnote for Christ if it's in the text. And the footnote will say, or Messiah, or it may go the other way around. That is a strategic title for Mark. It goes back to 1:1, whereas we get this seemingly important word here of chosen. That's not a theme in Mark, at least not using that word. Christos is, and so without doing a lengthy word study right now, you certainly could for this verse. And the way to do that would be, I mean, there's a few ways to do it. The way I would do it is right-click, search for the lexeme, and I would just add a range here for Mark, and I just want to see this list here. And it goes right back to the very beginning, that Jesus was named as Christ. Now, there's not a definite article here, but it's the same word. We do have Christos with the definite article in 829 and some other significant passages that we've looked at. So I think this would be a good time at least to spend a few minutes on, do I want to translate this Christ or Messiah, and what does it mean in this context? So I'm simply naming that here, maybe bookmarking that, but happy to hear comments or questions or observations that you've got. Let me just do two more little bullet points here, and then we'll stop for comments or questions. And we'll come back to this thought, but Strauss notes this section ends as it began with the warning against deceivers. In this case, it's false messiahs and false prophets. And then in verse 23, we'll see a call to watchfulness. We'll come back to that. But notice that even in this moment of saying, we'll get into this now with verse 22, to watch out as people are saying that this person is the Messiah or this person is a prophet. That goes back to the beginning of the passage. And I might even just open up an English Bible here so we can look more quickly at it. Yeah, Jesus began to say to them, watch out that no one misleads you, planese. And we're going to get this theme picked up again. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and they will mislead many. So this is a recapitulation of that theme. It really serves as bookends for verses, I don't know where we want to start it. Maybe start it in verse 5 with Jesus' dialogue through to the end of 23 that we'll see today. So I think that's worth noting, that this is circling back to a theme, and we're going to get more on this as we go. Finally, I'll just say France, in his New International Greek Testament commentary, has a great comment on verses 21 and 22, which I found to be both clarifying and also remind me of the challenge of interpreting Mark 13 as to who exactly are these people, when are they, and so on. But let's stop there. I want to see what comments or questions you have. Verse 22 is going to begin with this post-positive gar in the second position. So it's going to ground verse 21. It's going to give reason for why verse 21 exists, why Jesus is giving this particular warning. So it's connected. And we'll go there next after we see what comments and questions you all have. Here's an interesting comment. Somebody says, "Ide" may translate well as take note. Somebody says, Christ is not a name, it is a title in Greek. Messiah is the same title in Hebrew. Both mean anointed one. All right, great. Any other comments or questions on this? Why don't we move to verse 22, and then we'll see how this informs verse 21. We get back to accordance, and we'll get back to where we were in the passage. All right. Eger thesantai gar pseudo Christoi kai pseudo prophetai kai dosusin semeia kai terata prosta apoplanon edunatan tus eclectus. Going left to right, something like for will rise up pseudo Christs or false Christs, false messiahs, and pseudo false prophets, and they will do, or they will perform, or they will enact signs and wonders. Something like for the purpose of prosta, and with that prosta we expect an infinitive, which sure enough we get. So they'll perform signs and wonders to deceive or to lead astray, if possible, the chosen, or the chosen ones, or the elect. And however you translate it, I would just encourage consistency with whatever you did in verse 20, because from all we can tell, this is the same eklektos that's being talked about. All right, here's how I've rendered this. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, the chosen. I thought this was great. BDAG for Pseudochristoi has a bogus Messiah for a translation equivalent, which I was surprised to see the word bogus there, but I thought that's exactly what false is. This word, and both of these words are good to see, because the question is, I don't know that there's a very difficult question of of translation. I mean, pseudo is false, and Christoi, whether Christ or Messiah, same with false and prophet. That seems easy enough to translate. The question then is this a particular class of person, like are these people already in the consciousness? Have there been some historically? Who is this? So we want to look for these words. We will not find false Christ or false Messiah anywhere else in the Greek New Testament except for Matthew's parallel account. You can even see here how close the wording is. So that's the parallel account. So it's the same discourse. So we don't get a different significant context for that. We could do the same with pseudopropheti, search for lexeme, and that has more uses. So we've got some instances in Matthew and Luke. Unfortunately, it's the first time Mark uses it. So what would be great is, if Mark had talked about this before, who were these people? What were they doing? But we have some other passages where we can look at that, and I would encourage that. I'm not doing that extensively right now, but just to highlight that search. On pseudo-Christoi, when you search for that and don't see it in the NA28, you might also just change your search text to the Septuagint to see if that's there. And it's not. But false prophets or false prophet is in the Septuagint. So as we're trying to understand what these words mean, we get more context. There are 10 hits, one of which is Zechariah, the rest of which is Jeremiah, and actually 3 of them in Jeremiah 33, 4 rather, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that seems like it's going to be promising in terms of what are false prophets? Who are they? Is Jesus referring to an office, if you want to call it that the people would be familiar with? And at least with false prophets, yes. Now, maybe also false messiahs. We just don't have a word for that elsewhere in the New Testament to draw on. But this is where branching out into your commentaries, I think, would help, whatever you don't find as a word search. But I would take the time to look at both of these and see what they have to say. So what do? Well, they do signs and wonders, semeia kaiterata. And again, it's worth asking a similar question. Who all in the Greek New Testament performs signs and wonders, if they do? Because I think, and this is taking a couple steps of interpretation, but let's say you count yourself a disciple of Jesus today, and let's say you take this warning, at least in a general sense, regardless of how you come down on the timing. Let's say you interpret this as saying, I too should watch for false messiahs and false prophets. Well, if that's how you read it, you might also be thinking about signs and wonders. Jesus is saying one of the indicators of false messiahs and false prophets, whoever they are, whenever they are, is that they will rise up and perform signs and wonders. So let me see, is that treated anywhere else in the Bible? And this is an easy search to do in accordance. You can just select the phrase, right click, search for lexeme. That's going to give me specifically the phrase signs and wonders. Now you can go further than this and take out the chi and just do put an and connecting symbol there to get them in the same verse. So for example, you get great signs and wonders. That wouldn't have been picked up before with the exact phrase. So broaden out this search, but we got at least enough to work with just by this. You can almost think of it as like a stock phrase, and we don't know until we search it. But I'd say using this phrase 8 times in the New Testament, I mean, there's something to that phrase that I'd say that's a stock phrase. That's a thing. Even like now, if you're familiar with the biblical story and somebody says signs and wonders, you might that might connect with you because you've heard that before, because it's used often enough. So whether you do your search for this exact phrase, and then I would even broaden that out, maybe just Command D or Control D, duplicate a tab, and go in here and replace and make sure your scope is set to verse, which it is. So this will also show you sign and wonder used in the same verse. So here you've got 8 verses, here you've got 16 verses. And so this just broadens your search. So with these results then, the question is, who is doing these signs and wonders? And is there, it would be really helpful for my understanding of this passage if the Greek New Testament had, for example, somebody doing signs and wonders who was also a false prophet. Well, we get in John, Jesus saying, unless you see signs and wonders, you will never believe. So there is some connection to signs and wonders and belief. Bring about signs and wonders through the name of your holy servant Jesus. Miraculous signs and wonders by the hands of the apostles. Okay, so those are not false prophets. I would spend some time going through here and see what all you find. Certainly by the time you get to 2 Thessalonians 2:9, the arrival of the lawless one will be by Satan's working with all kinds of miracles and signs and false wonders. So that, at least to me, is something that I think, okay, and here's even the word pseudos. So I think, all right, that there's some overlap of language there. I'm gonna at least bookmark that and see how this might connect to Mark if it does. But the point being that I'm trying to, whether it's for my own just personal understanding now in terms of application or just interpretation, keeping it in the first century, I'm trying to answer the question, who performs signs and wonders? Are there other instances of signs and wonders being done in a deceptive way? And again, I just would advise broadening out that search after you search for the stock phrase and seeing what you find. You will find, like you've got Stephen doing it, and you will find other people attempting and sometimes successfully performing signs and wonders that are not doing it in the name of God or in the name of Jesus. You want to also search this in the Septuagint, see what you can find. One thinks about Pharaoh's magicians, for example. So that is broader than just translation, but I think it would be worth looking at to try to get a sense of what kind of people are we talking about. But with the exception of pseudokristoi, at least as a specific word, you have false prophets already. You have signs and wonders. Certainly deception is a theme. And so this is drawing on something that would not be novel to them. So what are these signs and wonders for? Well, they are to deceive, if possible, the chosen. So they're meant to convince. And you've got the same tous eklektus, the chosen or the elect, as I said, however you translated eklektos in verse 20, I would recommend following suit here. Craig Evans, and I won't read this whole thing, but he's got this great, this is the Word Biblical Commentary. He just notes these false messiahs and false prophets will offer signs and wonders, a phrase that echoes Old Testament tradition. And then the false prophet hopes to gain acceptance through signs. And then there's even some warning here in Deuteronomy 13:2. And if you had done this, I mean, if we had taken more time to do this search in the Septuagint, we would see this ourselves, but commentaries are great here. Even this plural combination of signs and wonders, this is well worth considering. One more comment on this verse, and then I want to check in with you. How do we understand a dunaton, if possible? So what we've got here is for false prophets, for false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, the chosen. Now, once again, I think the translation, in my opinion anyway, is fairly straightforward on this verse. The question of meaning and interpretation may be a little more challenging. A dunaton is just if possible. And so what we've got here is neuter singular nominative. Again, if you go to the diagrams and want to see what part of speech is this, they're going to give you an implied verb. It's a verbless clause in Greek. I think actually this verbless clause works great in English because we say if possible all the time. I mean, that's and it is a verbless clause. What's implied is if a thing be possible or if a thing is possible. And so here you've got ae dunaton, so that implied verb there. So in translation, I think easy call for me, keep this a verbless clause. But what does it mean? if possible. The SIL Exegetical Summary Series, very mercifully for those of us wrestling through interpretation, asks the question so often on our mind, which is it possible to deceive the chosen ones? So again, perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, the chosen. Well, this if here is if, and so Jesus doesn't, in my mind, seem to be answering this clearly, but we've got a couple of options here. The SIL Exegetical Summary Series classifies two options. One, even though the aim is to deceive believers and lead them astray, the addition of if possible indicates that they will not succeed. So in that interpretation, it would be something like false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform signs and wonders to deceive, as if that were possible, the chosen. I struggle to see that as what the text is saying, all due respect to these wonderful sources. This second meaning, this means that there is a possibility, and that's just how I read, if possible. It's a possibility. They may succeed in leading some astray. It does not indicate whether or not the false messiahs will succeed in deceiving some of the elect. The point is that they will try to deceive the disciples, and they may or may not succeed in individual cases. That is a long explanation of the word if, and that's how I read it. In fact, what's most important here is what's about to come, which we'll transition to after we check in on your comments and questions. But Jesus is going to use this all to get back to, but y'all beware. And it's because I think of this possibility, even the possibility of being deceived by these false messiahs and false prophets leads to the disciples needing to be cautious, to beware. And of course, there is the possibility now that chosen, you can connect that to the humace in verse 23. Again, that's a point of interpretation. I think there's more to unearth there. But the whole point of all of this, I think, is, yeah, this is a live possibility. I respect that other people read, they will not succeed. I do not see how that follows from the text personally. But the point is beware, regardless of what's possible or not. Here's what's going to be happening, and it's not going to be easy. So pray that it doesn't happen in winter. Get out of there quickly, because here's what's going on. So that's a lot. It's an intense scene to imagine, and that's why we end with a warning in verse 23, which is how we'll close. But let me hear from you on this verse or any other questions. Here's a comment somebody makes. Let me share this anonymously. Somebody says, comment to Mark 13:20. Let's go back to that. For the elect's sake whom he hath chosen, rhetorical figure of speech called polyptaton that involves the repetition of a word in different forms or cases within a sentence. Yeah, and we had that with the creation which he created. In this case, the noun chosen and the verb choose share the same root, but appear in different forms to emphasize the importance of concept of selection or choice in the bigger context that describes terrible punishment. Great. Yeah, thanks for that comment. Yeah, and I think there is emphasis there. We looked at that in verse 19 last time. The beginning of creation, which God created. He's the one, same thing with the chosenness there. I was not familiar with that rhetorical, or that word for the rhetorical device. I wonder if that would be in your Pocket Biblical Studies dictionary. We can look. It's not. It may be elsewhere in accordance. But anyway, yeah, thanks for that comment. That's great. Appreciate that. Yeah, great. Yes, thank you. Somebody else says, Simon the Sorcerer, Acts 8, could be a New Testament example of doing signs and wonders, but those exact words may not be there. Yeah, that's great. And that shows you, I think, the possible limitations of the strict word searching that we're doing. I mean, exactly to the point of this comment, that could be exactly the same kind of thing Jesus is talking about. Acts 8 may just not use those particular words. It may use one of them. You'd want to go look at it. But I think certainly thematically, what we're talking about is somebody who is using them namely these signs and wonders, to get people to believe. Oh, here's a great comment. Somebody else says, wouldn't the Holy Spirit indwelling stop the elect from being deceived, or at least for long term, maybe in our flesh? That is a great question. I am a pastor before I'm a webinar instructor, so I love that question as a pastor. And yeah, it's just a great question. That's what you would want for sure. And it's one way that people do read this passage. That is not an uncommon read of this passage. I think the answer, how does human deception work in real time? Even people who are filled with the Holy Spirit. Again, I'm a pastor and I spend a lot of time in my church and other churches, and I see a lot of Christians be deceived. So I think on the ground, anyone can be deceived. So to me, it just points to this: beware, you beware. I mean, that I think, you could use this passage and talk about why are people deceived, and that's all super important. I think at the end, what Mark and what Jesus are trying to do is call, first of all, these 4 disciples, and then beyond that, concentric circles. I think all disciples call people to beware because of what Jesus has told us. So implied in this next verse, which we'll get to in just a moment, is that the way that you can beware, the way that you can be cautious, the way that you can guard against deception is through the words of Jesus. I have told you everything in advance. Again, Jesus doesn't make that connection explicit, but he says right after beware, I've told you everything in advance, and he's given these specific instructions. There's something in that one of the ways to not be taken in by signs and wonders and false messiahs and false prophets has to do with what Jesus has told. So there's something there, going back to those words, really, and again, this is the pastor in me talking, but really letting them work on you and things like that. But that, I love that question, and that's great, and I'd love to have a longer conversation about that. Yeah, and so here's another comment similar to that. Somebody says, deceived, yes, but not to the point of causing loss of salvation. Is this correct? Yeah, I don't know. That feels like a big question that, this would be a great research project in accordance. There's a lot of directions I would suggest going here. I think, one of them that we didn't do is looking at this word for deceive. So I think that's going to be possible, or that's going to be a good entry point here. In fact, I would just, you've got this apo prefix, but I would just do, how would I do this? I would do asterisks and do like a root there, so that I get, here I've got 57 words to choose from. So I would start there, and kind of work my way and see what happens when people are deceived. What impact does it have on them? As far as, a person's salvation status, obviously that's, it's, yeah, that's a very big theological question, but I sure appreciate it. And I think this passage raises it. Again, there's something about these words that whenever they had their most immediate proximate fulfillment, whether you think that was the first century, whether you think it's still to come, whether you think it's both, there is that more general warning that I think is super important, which is don't be taken in. I don't think it's a stretch of interpretation to gather from this that Jesus wants this not just for these 4 specific disciples that are asking, but for all disciples. Great questions. Let me get one more comment here, and then we'll be caught up and we'll move on. Somebody says, verse 22, let me just get back to that. Pros ta apoplanon is an articular infinitive, right? So you've got the infinitive here and the article conveying particular condition or state of being, carries emphasis toward the finished goal of the false prophets and false messiahs. That's right. So you might even, the English word to may already do that work for you, but if you feel like you really want to make sure that comes out in your translation, you might render it something like perform signs and wonders in order to deceive, if possible, the chosen. But yeah, that's a great comment on the grammar. Thank you for that. Good, Good comments, good questions, great as always. Especially appreciate everything that folks are saying today. Well, we get a short verse in verse 23. We'll wrap up with that. I think we'll probably have time for comments or questions, but humes de blepete proerica humin panta. Left to right, you, but, well, this de post positive, which just means it's in second position in the sentence. In English, that tends to be first. So we just put it over there. But you, beware, be on guard, watch out, come back to that word. I have told you everything or all things. Now, this neuter plural accusative panta, it's one word. I suppose you could translate it as I have told you all. That doesn't quite feel like the best translation, but you could. But this panta in the neuter plural accusative carries with it often this implied things. So that's not over translating at all. But you also may just want to do the one English word everything. But you beware, I've told you everything in advance. This word here, prolego, you probably recognize lego as tell, but the pra here, and it just tells you here in BDAG, to say something in advance of an event, to predict, to tell beforehand, to foretell. Think about how you want to translate that. I think it would probably be bulky to say, I have foretold you everything. You would keep one Greek word with one English word that way. But the meaning anyway is clear. You beware, emphatic. You don't need the humes grammatically because it's already included in blepete. It's clear from the way that this word is formed or the morphology that this is a second plural imperative. We've had imperatives all through this passage, even the recent verses. And here's another one. You beware, emphatic. I have told you everything in advance. I noted here just a little bit about this. I said this already, but I've told you everything in advance. I've told you everything before it happens. And the idea being, I've told you everything before it happens so that you can beware and take action when it does happen. That's the goal here. So, be on your guard. You know what to look for now. You know what to do. Refer back to my previous words. I think there's really a lot. It's just such a short six Greek words. But by the time you get to this point, with everything that Jesus has said, there's a lot wrapped up into this. And note the tie-in to verses 4 and 5. We saw this already from Strauss, and I think just about every commentary I checked mentioned this too, but you see it at the word level even before you get to your commentaries. You've got proerica from prolego. I've told you in advance. In verse 4, you had, actually, let me do it this way. I'm going to open up two windows or two tabs. We're going to do Mark 13:4. All right, now we can see them together. So we have tell us, apon humin. This is the four disciples saying, tell us, from lego. And now Jesus is saying, I have told you. So there's a conclusion there. Remember at the beginning of the passage that one of the questions was, well, it's two questions. When are these things going to happen, and what is the sign that they will take place? Interesting. Here's the word sign. He's saying, watch out for false signs. But they're saying, tell us, that we still wonder, all through this discourse, has he told them? Has he answered their question? Well, he's saying now, I have told you everything. So yeah, like that, there's nothing left to tell if he's told everything. But at the word level, it ties in quite nicely to verse 4. So does blepete. Beware, that was in verse 5. He begins this thing. Jesus began to say to them, blepete, first word out of his mouth in response to their question. And you get it again here. But you beware. Like I said before, beware. Once again, beware. There's some emphasis there. It comes up in verse 5. It's also in verse 9, if you want to go back and look at that. And then there's a tie-in, I think, at the word level with panta. Verse 4, they said panta. He's saying panta again here. Just at the word level, you can see these as bookends. And I think for me, what's helpful about this is I try to make my way through this passage, and we'll end with this and then take questions. I think, however you split up Mark 13, this to me gives a nice inclusio is the technical term for it, which my word processor always wants to autocorrect to inclusion, which is the idea that you've got bookends. It's like an A and an A prime. It's saying the same thing to kind of indicate that everything in between is connected. There's a thematic repetition. So I think whatever we still don't know about this passage or still struggle to interpret, or maybe you don't struggle, but I think reading verses 4 through 23, or maybe even starting in verse 5 where Jesus speaks, I think we can be pretty confident that they are about the same general things, maybe, and you may disagree with this, which I welcome if you do, but maybe even all in the same timeline. Now, I'm not as confident about the timeline question when we get to verse 24, because at that point, we've got the sun being darkened and the moon not giving its light and the Son of Man arriving in the clouds. So that to me sounds maybe like a different timeline, but if verses 4 through 23 or 5 through 23, I think hold together in the same timeline. And I think this semantic or this word level repetition is Mark/Jesus trying to reinforce that. Again, you may not agree with that, but I think it's certainly the word commonalities are there. And I just put Strauss in here again, and I put Lane from another commentary, New International commentary on the New Testament. He's talking about the all things which Jesus had told them corresponds to the request of the disciples to know when these things are all to be accomplished. So that goes back to verse 4. And he says from the structural perspective, the response to the question of verse 4 is complete with verse 23, which is a point of interpretation. I find it compelling. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, maybe you're not sure. But in this interpretation, we'll look at this again more next week. Then verse 24, potentially at least, is talking about a different time frame. And whatever you think about timing, Jesus has said, I mean, this is certain because it's just straight off the text. Jesus has said, I have told you everything. And presumably the everything is in response to their question. It's almost like he's saying, I have answered your question now, and then moves on in verse 24. That's how I read it. And that's how a number of commentators read it as well. But regardless of what you think or how you parse this all out, do notice this tie-in and think about, you might even just take a moment, and I'll just end with this comment, but you might even take a moment to go to, let's see, look at what an inclusio is and how it functions. Framing or bracketing, opening phrase or idea is repeated at the end, reinforcing the importance of the words. It may be worth looking at how else does an inclusio function? What does it tell me about what's in the middle? That's probably worth looking at because that could help you understand how Mark 13 holds together. All right, I would be happy for comments or questions. I'm going to end the recording just so that folks who want to go on time can. And I'll give you a discount code in just a moment. If you're watching this on the recording, thanks so much for joining. Thanks especially to those of you here live now. If you want the handout, again, tinyurl.com/marktranslationnotes, and my email address is there as well.